stayed. I loved him, and for 31 years I believed that was enough. His name was Arthur. Mine is Evelyn, and this is the story of how I nearly lost everything I had built with my own 2 hands. Not to a stranger, but to the man who used to bring me coffee every morning without being asked, who knew I took it with 1 sugar and a splash of cream, who once drove 4 hours in a snowstorm because I'd called him crying over nothing. I can even remember now. That man existed. I am sure of it. I have photographs. The man who handed me those papers on a Tuesday afternoon in March did not look like him. He had the same face, the same slight forward lean when he stood, the same way of clearing his throat before he said something he thought was important. But something behind his eyes had gone flat and cold in a way I hadn't let myself see coming, even though, and I know this now, it had been there for a long time before that Tuesday. We met in 1991 at a church potluck in Dayton, Ohio. I had brought a green bean casserole. He had brought nothing and eaten half of mine, and I thought that was charming. I was 34 years old and working as an office manager for a small orthodontic practice, and Arthur was a contractor who just started his own renovation company. We married 18 months later in a small ceremony at my sister's house in Columbus. My sister, her name is Paulette, made the cake herself. Lemon with buttercream. It was perfect. We moved to Cincinnati 7 years in, when Arthur's business started growing faster than either of us had expected. I left my job to help him. That was my choice, made freely. And I want to say that clearly because later, in that lawyer's office, someone would try to tell a different story about it. I kept the books. I answered phones in the early years when we couldn't afford a receptionist. I tracked invoices, managed subcontractor payments, filed quarterly taxes, and sat beside Arthur at every bank meeting when he was trying to secure lines of credit and the loan officers kept directing their questions to him instead of me, even though I was the one with the spreadsheets. We built that business together. Arthur Home Renovations became one of the more respected mid-sized contractors in the greater Cincinnati area. By the time we were in our late 50s, we had 18 full-time employees, a commercial office in Blue Ash, and a house in Hyde Park that we'd bought for $340,000, and that had, by last year, been appraised at just over $900,000. We had retirement accounts. We had investments. We had a life that looked from the outside exactly like what 2 people are supposed to have after 30 years of working side by side. What I did not have was full visibility into what Arthur had been doing with the business finances for the previous 4 years. I found that out later, much later, after the papers. That Tuesday I was 65 years old. Arthur was 67. I had just come back from walking our dog, a beagle named Biscuit, who Arthur pretended not to love, but who slept on his side of the bed whenever Arthur travelled. I was still in my jacket when he came into the kitchen and set a manila envelope on the counter and said, very quietly, "I need you to look at this." I thought it was something about the business. A contract dispute, maybe. A tax issue. I pulled out the papers and read the first page, and then I stood there for a long time not saying anything. He was filing for divorce. I asked him why. He said we had grown apart. I asked him if there was someone else. He looked at the window instead of at me and said that wasn't the point. I have spent a great deal of time since then understanding that it was in fact very much the point. Her name was apparently Suzanne. She worked for one of our suppliers. She was 44 years old. I didn't cry in front of him. I want to remember that clearly. I did not cry. I said I needed to call my sister. He said that was fine. He took Biscuit for a walk, and I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and called Paulette and told her what had just happened, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Evelyn, listen to me. You need a lawyer before you do anything else, before you sign anything, before you agree to anything, before you even have another real conversation with him. Do you hear me?" I heard her. The lawyer I found first, a man named Gerald, who had an office downtown and had been recommended by a colleague of Arthur's, which I later realized should have concerned me, was pleasant enough but not particularly aggressive. He reviewed the initial filing and told me the division of assets would likely be straightforward. Community property principles. The business would be valued and split. The house, too. He said it in the tone of someone describing a mildly tedious administrative process. Something about that bothered me. I couldn't name it precisely at the time, but something in me said, this is not as simple as he is making it sound. I went home and I started reading. I am not a lawyer, I never went to college, but I know how to find information and I know how to follow a thread, and what I found when I started pulling at the edges of our financial records I had access to, records I had helped create, was a thread that led somewhere I had not expected. Arthur had formed an LLC, 2 of them actually. The first, registered in Delaware, had been created 4 years earlier. The second, registered in Ohio under a slightly different name, had been created 14 months ago. I had never heard of either of them. Our accountant, a man we had used for over a decade, a man who came to our Christmas party every year, had signed documentation related to both. I sat with that for a long time. Then I called Paulette again and told her what I'd found. And she said, very quietly, "Evelyn, you need a different lawyer." I found her through a legal directory for Ohio attorneys specializing in high asset divorce and financial misconduct. Her name was Vera Hutchins. She had an office in Kenwood. She was in her early 50s, small and precise, with reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck, and a manner that was direct without being unkind. When I sat across from her desk and laid out everything I'd found, the LLCs, the dates, the accounting irregularities I'd noticed once I knew what to look for, she looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "You did this research yourself?" I said I had. She nodded slowly. "Walk me through it again. Everything." I did. And when I was finished, she took off her glasses and set them on the desk and said, "What your husband has done is something we see with some regularity in cases involving closely held businesses. The strategy is to move assets, revenue, equity, receivables, into entities that appear to be separate from marital property. The goal is to reduce the apparent value of what's available to split. The problem for him," she said, "is that he did it while you were still married, and that means it falls squarely within the scope of fraudulent transfer law." She paused. "We can unwind this," she said, "but you need to be prepared for him to make this difficult. And I need to ask you something honestly." I told her to ask. "Your children," she said, "where do they stand?" That question cost me something to answer. We have 2 children. Our son Owen is 40 years old and lives in Nashville. Our daughter Priscilla is 37 and lives here in Cincinnati, about 20 minutes from us. Owen had always been closer to his father in the way that some sons are, not cold toward me, but gravitationally oriented toward Arthur in the way that meant, when conflict arrived, his first instinct was to stand on his father's side. Priscilla, I had believed, would be different. She wasn't. The first call I got from her, 2 days after I'd retained Vera, was not a call asking how I was doing. It was a call in which she told me in a careful and measured tone that I recognized as rehearsed that she and her husband thought I was making this harder than it needed to be. That Arthur had told them I was being unreasonable, that the lawyers would cost more than any settlement difference would be worth, that it might be better for everyone if I just worked with him. I asked her if she had spoken with her father before calling me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said yes. I said, "I need you to understand something. The business that paid for your college, that paid for your wedding, that paid for the down payment on your house, I helped build that. 31 years. I kept the books, Priscilla. I know what's in them, and what I found in them is why I have a lawyer." She said she didn't want to take sides. I said it seemed to me she already had. I don't say that with bitterness now. I've done a great deal of work, real work, with a therapist named Dr. Turs, Bryce, whom I started seeing that April, to get to a place where I can say that I understand why my children did what they did. They were afraid. They were being fed a version of events that made me the obstacle rather than the victim, and they had their own interests, financial and emotional, in the outcome of this divorce. I understand all of that. Understanding it does not make it hurt less, but it made it possible for me to keep going. Vera moved quickly. She filed a motion for full financial disclosure and an independent business valuation. She brought in a forensic accountant, a woman named Teresa, who arrived at our first meeting with a laptop, and what I can only describe as a professional appetite for uncovering things people had tried to hide. Within 6 weeks, Teresa had traced the movement of approximately $480,000 in business revenue that had been redirected through the 2 LLCs over the previous 4 years. She had documented payments to Suzanne's consulting company, a company that had been incorporated just 3 months before the first LLC, a company that had no website, no employees, and no apparent business purpose beyond receiving those payments. The forensic accounting report was 47 pages long. I read every page. Some of it I had to read twice, but I understood it, and what it told me was that my husband had spent 4 years methodically preparing to leave me with as little as possible. There was a mediation session in June. Arthur came with his lawyer, a man named Fitzpatrick, who had the particular manner of someone accustomed to winning by wearing people down. Arthur himself sat across the table from me for the first time since the papers, and he looked tired and a little smaller than I remembered, and he did not look at me directly for most of the session. His offer was insulting. The house, a fraction of the retirement accounts, nothing from the business, which his side was valuing based on the cleaned figures that did not account for the redirected revenue, the LLC transfers, any of it. Fitzpatrick presented it as generous. He used the word reasonable 4 times in 11 minutes. I counted. Vera looked at the offer and then looked at me. I shook my head. She turned to Fitzpatrick and laid out, calmly and in some detail, what Teresa had found and what the legal implications were. Fraudulent transfer, dissipation of marital assets, the consulting payments that would not survive scrutiny. Fitzpatrick maintained his composure, but I watched Arthur's face when Vera named the amounts, and something moved across it that I recognized as fear. We left without an agreement. That was the right call. September came and went. My granddaughter started kindergarten, Priscilla's daughter, Molly, and I was not invited to the first day. That was the hardest single thing, I think. Not the business, not the house, not any of the money. The morning I should have been standing on that sidewalk with a camera, and I was instead sitting in my kitchen with Biscuit's head in my lap, trying to understand how it had gotten to this place. I called Paulette that night. She drove up from Columbus the next weekend and stayed for 4 days, and we watched old movies, and she made her chicken and rice soup, and we talked about our mother, and about the things that don't change, and the things that don't. There is no substitution for a sister who shows up. In October, Vera called me with an update. Fitzpatrick had reached out. Arthur wanted to revisit the terms. I asked what had changed. Vera said she believed Arthur's accountant had advised him that the LLC strategy would not hold up in court, and that proceeding to trial would likely result in worse terms for him than settling now. She paused and then said, "He's also been asking about timeline. He wants this resolved before the new year." I asked her why. She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know for certain, but I've learned that Suzanne is expecting a child." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. I went for a walk. It was a cold evening, early October, the leaves just starting to turn along the park near our house. I walked for probably an hour, longer than I planned, and Biscuit trotted along beside me with his ears flopping, and I thought about the man I had married and the man he had become, and whether those were really 2 different men or just 2 different phases of the same one. I thought about 31 years of morning coffee. I thought about the green bean casserole. I thought about Paulette's lemon cake and the 4-hour snowstorm drive and all the things that had been true once. I thought about Molly. When I got home, I called Vera, and I told her I was ready to negotiate in earnest, but that I had a number and I was not moving below it. I named the number. It was based on Teresa's valuation of the business, including the redirected assets, a fair division of the retirement accounts, the house, and a structured buyout of my equity stake in Arthur Home Renovations. It took 3 more weeks and 2 counteroffers, but Arthur signed. The settlement included the house, which I later sold, half of our combined retirement and investment accounts, and a structured buyout of my business equity that would be paid over 4 years. The total was significantly more than his first offer, significantly more than Gerald, my first lawyer, had suggested I could expect. I want to say something about that because I think it matters. I am 66 years old. I spent 31 years managing money I never fully controlled, working inside a structure that was built with both our efforts but registered in one name. I did not go to college. I did not have a career with my name on the door. And everything I walked out of that marriage with, I walked out with because I paid attention, because I trusted what I knew, because I refused to be told what I was worth by someone who had spent 4 years trying to reduce that number. Owen called in November. His voice was different, quieter, less certain. He said he had been talking to some people, and that he thought maybe he hadn't fully understood what had happened. He didn't apologize exactly, but he asked how I was, and he asked it in a way that meant he wanted to actually know the answer, and that was something. Priscilla took longer. She called me in January, just after the New Year. She asked if she could bring Molly over on a Saturday. I said yes. When they arrived, Priscilla stood in the doorway for a moment, and then she said, "I'm sorry, Mom." Just that. Just those 3 words. And I let her in. We are not what we were. I think that is true, and I think pretending otherwise would be a lie neither of us needs. But we are rebuilding, slowly, on terms that feel honest. Molly sat in my kitchen and drew pictures with the markers I keep in the drawer for her, and I made grilled cheese, which is still her favourite, and Priscilla and I drank coffee at the table while Molly narrated everything she was drawing in a continuous cheerful monologue. And it was, for a little while, ordinary. Just ordinary. I can't tell you how much that cost me and how much it was worth. I sold the house in February. I had a moment, standing in the empty kitchen the morning of the closing, when I thought I might not be able to do it. 31 years of living in those walls. My daughter's heights marked in pencil on the door frame of the pantry, which I had photographed but could not take. The garden I had planted and replanted every spring. The kitchen window where I used to stand in the early mornings before anyone else was awake, watching the yard go from dark to grey to light while the coffee brewed. I stood there for a long time. Then I said goodbye to all of it, out loud, to the empty room, which I know may sound strange but felt necessary. I said goodbye to the version of my life that had happened inside those walls, the good and the bad of it, the casserole and the papers and everything in between. Then I left. I moved to a condominium in Hyde Park, 2 miles from the old house, close enough to Priscilla and Molly that the distance isn't a burden, but far enough that I am building something that is mine in a way the house never fully was. I bought a small writing desk that sits by the window. I have a balcony where I keep herbs, rosemary, thyme, 2 kinds of basil, and in the evenings I sit out there with Biscuit and watch the light change over the rooftops, and I think about what comes next. I started a small bookkeeping service. 3 clients so far. I charge fair rates and I do good work, and I like being paid directly for something I'm genuinely good at. It is not the same as running a company, but it is mine, start to finish, and there is something in that I had not expected to feel this late, a kind of lightness. Paulette came up last month. We sat on the balcony until it got too cold and then moved inside, and she told me about her granddaughter, who has just learned to ride a bike, and I told her about a client who sent me flowers after I caught an error that would have cost him more than $3,000 in penalties. We laughed. We ate the soup she brought. She stayed 2 nights, and when she left I stood at the door and felt, for the first time in a long time, that I recognized my own life. I planted something in a pot on the balcony last week. A small rose bush, the climbing kind, though there isn't much to climb on a fifth-floor balcony. My neighbour asked me about it. She's about my age, recently retired, recently widowed. She said, "Do you think it'll bloom up here?" I told her I thought it probably would, given enough time and enough sun. She seemed to like that answer. I think I did too. I think about the woman who walked into Vera's office that first day, the folder of printed spreadsheets tucked under her arm, the reading glasses she kept taking on and off because her hands needed something to do. I think about how she almost didn't make that appointment, how she almost called Gerald back instead. How close I came to accepting a version of the story that someone else had written for me. What I know now is that the outcome of my life didn't change because I got lucky. It changed because at a moment when it would have been much easier to go quiet, I chose not to. That choice, to keep looking, to keep asking, to trust what I knew even when the people around me were suggesting I didn't know very much. That was not luck, that was something I had to decide, alone, in a kitchen in Hyde Park, with a beagle asleep on my feet, and 31 years of records sitting in a filing cabinet upstairs. Arthur hid what he hid, because he believed I wouldn't find it. And the reason he believed that, I think, is because he had watched me defer for a long time. I had deferred on the accounts being in his name. I had deferred on which accountant we used. I had deferred on things I shouldn't have, and somewhere along the way he had confused my patience with ignorance. That was his miscalculation. Not the LLCs, not the timing, not the legal strategy. The miscalculation was simpler than all of that. He mistook a woman who chose to trust him for a woman who didn't know any better. Integrity, in my experience, is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's the thing that makes you go back and read the document again, even when you're tired. It's the thing that makes you tell the lawyer the truth, even when the truth is embarrassing. It's the thing that made me say to Priscilla, when she called to ask me to back down, that I couldn't, not because I was angry, but because what Arthur had done was wrong, and I knew it was wrong, and I had spent too many years letting things I knew were wrong go unnamed. Knowing things is not the same as doing something with what you know. I had the knowledge for years. I had access to the records. I understood the numbers. What I lacked for a long time was the willingness to follow what I knew to wherever it led, even if it led somewhere uncomfortable. That willingness to think clearly, to ask hard questions, to hire the forensic accountant and sit with 47 pages of findings and not look away, that is what made the difference. Not intelligence as a gift, intelligence as a practice, as a choice made over and over again, even when it's inconvenient. And then there is the part that nobody talks about as much, the staying power, not the dramatic courtroom kind, the quiet kind, the kind that gets you through the September when your granddaughter starts kindergarten and you're not there. The kind that gets you through the mediation where Fitzpatrick says reasonable 4 times and you have to sit still and not respond. Paulette drove up from Columbus and made soup. Dr. Pounds and made soup. Bryce helped me understand what I was carrying. I kept going. That's the whole of it, really. I kept going on the days when keeping going was the only thing available to me, and eventually those days added up to something I could stand in and call my life. The rose bush on the balcony has 3 buds on it now. My neighbour asked about them yesterday. I told her they'd probably open by the end of the month, given the sun we've been getting. She seemed pleased. So did I.